I found him in my barn with a bullet in his shoulder and blood soaked through to his belt. I brought him inside because that's what you do. I cleaned the wound because that's what you do. I fed him because a body needs food to heal. And it was only afterward, washing the blood off my hands at the kitchen basin, that I remembered where I'd seen his face before. The newspaper. Page 1. $500, dead or alive, for armed robbery and the shooting of a bank clerk in Cheyenne. I went back into the kitchen with that knowledge sitting behind my eyes. He looked up from the plate and he knew. I could see him know it, the way you can see a man register that the ground under him has shifted. And neither of us said a word about it because I had already decided something before I walked back in, and he had already decided that I had. My name is Sarah Prescott. I have run the Prescott place alone since my husband Daniel was killed by a rock slide in the spring of 1879, 2 years before any of this happened. Daniel and I had come to Texas Hill Country from Tennessee in 1874, drawn by land that was cheaper and more plentiful than anything we could have afforded back home, and we had spent 5 years building something before a section of loose shale above the north pasture let go on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and ended it. There is no elegant way to describe grief of that kind. It arrives and then it stays, in a lower register for the rest of your life, and you learn to work alongside it the way you learn to work alongside weather, not fought, just accounted for. I had kept the ranch because it was mine to keep, and because Daniel and I had built it together, and abandoning it would have felt like abandoning him twice. 2 years alone had taught me things I had not previously known about fencing, about cattle sickness, about the particular arithmetic of a household budget with only one income instead of two. I had also learned, in those 2 years, to trust my own judgment in situations where there was no one else to consult, because there simply wasn't anyone else, and a decision delayed waiting for outside confirmation was frequently a decision that cost you the thing you were trying to protect. This habit of trusting my own judgment mattered considerably on the Tuesday morning I found Jesse Colton in my barn. 60 acres of good Texas Hill Country, cattle and a kitchen garden, and the particular independence of a woman who has learned that grief and work can occupy the same body without either one canceling the other out. I found the injured man in my barn on a Tuesday morning in April when I went out to feed the stock, and found instead a stranger collapsed against the hay with a wound that had bled through his shirt and his trousers and had stopped, mostly, on its own, which told me he had been there for some hours already and had been lucky in the ways that matter. He was conscious. Barely, but conscious, and his pale blue eyes found my face when I came in, and he said, in a voice worn down to almost nothing, "I'll be gone by dark. Just needed somewhere the blood would stop." I looked at him for a long moment. I have made a number of decisions in my life by instinct rather than by careful deliberation, and this was one of them. I said, "You'll bleed to death in my barn before dark if I leave you here. Can you walk to the house?" He could not. Not without help. I got him inside, which took considerably longer than it should have, given his size, because a wounded man is not an easy thing to move regardless of how light he is, and I laid him on the kitchen floor because the bed would have been worse to clean, and I cut away the shirt and looked at the wound properly. It was a bullet wound, entry and exit both, through the meat of the left shoulder, missing the bone by what looked like a stroke of pure luck. It had bled considerably and was still seeping, but had not hit anything that would kill him quickly, provided infection didn't set in. I cleaned it the way my mother had taught me, carbolic acid diluted properly, which stung enough that he made a sound through his teeth and apologized for it immediately, which struck me as an odd thing for a man in his condition to think about. I bandaged it properly. I gave him water. I asked him his name. He said, "Jesse." I said, "Jesse what?" He looked at me for a moment before he answered, which told me the hesitation meant something, though I did not yet know what. He said, "Jesse Colton." I did not know the name, and if he was lying about it, it was a plausible enough lie that I had no immediate way to test it. I want to be clear about the sequence of events, because it matters. I did not connect his face to anything while I was cleaning the wound. I connected it afterward, alone at the wash basin, scrubbing his blood off my hands, when the particular set of his jaw and the color of his hair arranged themselves in my memory against an image I had seen 3 days before in the Fort Worth paper that came through with the mail wagon. The wanted notice had described light blonde hair, pale eyes, a scar through the left brow, tall and lean. Wanted for armed robbery of the Cattleman's Bank in Cheyenne and for the shooting of a bank clerk during the commission of the robbery. $500, dead or alive. I stood at the wash basin with the water going pink, and I thought about the man on my kitchen floor with a scar through his left eyebrow. I want to explain what I did next, because I have turned it over many times since, and I believe I understand my own reasoning, though I did not have all of it clearly available to me in the moment. I went back into the kitchen. I looked at him. He was watching me. He had been watching the door since I left, I could tell, with the specific alertness of a man who has learned to track exits. And something in my face must have told him what had happened at the basin, because his own expression changed, not to guilt, to a kind of tired resignation, the look of a man who has been expecting a particular reckoning and has just watched it arrive. He said, "You know." I said, "I know what the paper says." He said, "And what do you think?" I sat down at the kitchen table, which put me at his eye level where he lay on the floor, and I looked at him properly. Not at the wanted notice's description, but at the actual man. His hands, which were long and careful, and did not have the look of hands accustomed to a gun, though I could not have said with certainty what a gun-accustomed hand looked like, only that his did not match my assumption of it. His eyes, which held mine without the shifting evasion I would have expected from a guilty man being confronted. The way he had apologized for making a sound when the carbolic acid stung, which was a small thing, but small things tell you about a person's habits, and a man who apologizes reflexively for his own pain is not, in my experience, the same category of man who shoots a bank clerk during a robbery. I said, "I think the paper describes your hair color and the scar accurately. I think I don't know what it describes accurately beyond that." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't shoot the clerk." I said, "Tell me what happened." He told me, slowly, because talking cost him something in his condition, and I let him take the time he needed. He had been in Cheyenne working as a hand for a freight company. He had been in the bank on the day of the robbery. A genuine coincidence, he said, and I noted that he did not overstate his innocence or plead for belief, just stated it plainly and let it sit there to be evaluated. 2 men had robbed the bank. One of them had shot the clerk when the man moved for an alarm. Jesse had been standing near the door and had been struck by the fleeing robbers on their way out, which accounted for a facial bruise the notice had apparently mistaken for evidence of a fight he'd been part of rather than a fight he'd been caught in the middle of. The bank's owner, a man named Holloway, had needed someone to blame quickly. The actual robbers had escaped clean, and the town wanted an answer faster than an investigation could provide one. Jesse, a transient worker with no family in the area, and a face that matched tall, light-haired, well enough to serve, had been the convenient answer. He'd been arrested, held 3 days, and had escaped during a transfer to the territorial jail when the wagon was ambushed, not by allies of his, he was careful to specify, but by an unrelated group after the transfer guard's payroll, whose interference happened to give him his only opportunity. He'd been running since, shot in the process by a bounty hunter 2 counties back, and had made it as far as my barn before the blood loss caught up with him. I sat with this account for a long time. I said, "That's a complicated story to verify." He said, "I know." I said, "And I have no way to verify any of it beyond what you've told me." He said, "I know that too." I looked at him. He looked back at me with the specific steadiness of a man who has decided not to argue for his own believability, which I found, against my better judgment, more convincing than a passionate defense would have been. I said, "I'm going to feed you. Then we'll decide what happens next." He said, "You don't have to." I said, "I'm aware of that." I made supper. He ate what he could manage, sitting up against the wall with considerable effort, and I sat across from him at the table, and we ate in a silence that was not comfortable, but was not hostile either. The silence of 2 people who have just exchanged something significant and are giving it room to settle. Over the following 4 days, while his shoulder began the slow work of healing, I made a decision about what I believed, and I made it the way I make most decisions, by observation rather than by argument. I watched how he moved, careful never to overstate his injury for sympathy and never to understate it out of pride. I watched how he treated the few interactions we had, courteous without performance, direct without aggression. I watched him with my dog, an elderly and suspicious animal who took to him within a day, which I have learned to trust more than I trust most human character references. I watched him decline, twice, an opportunity to ask me for money or supplies beyond what I offered freely, which a man planning to exploit my hospitality would not have declined. None of this was proof. I want to be honest about that. I had no proof, only the accumulated weight of small observations, which is not the same thing as evidence and would not have held up in any court. But it was enough for me to act on, because I was the one who had to decide. And a woman alone on 60 acres develops her own standards for what she trusts, standards that are not always the standards a courtroom would apply. On the 5th day, Marshal Cobb came through on his regular circuit and stopped at my gate, as he did every few weeks, to check that things were well with the widow Prescott. This was the moment I had been anticipating and had not fully prepared for. Jesse was in the house, well enough to sit but not well enough to run, and a $500 bounty was sitting at my kitchen table in plain view of the county's actual law. I made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds, standing at my gate. I told Marshal Cobb the truth. Not the whole truth immediately. I told him I had a wounded stranger recovering in my house, and that I believed his account of what had happened in Cheyenne, and that I would like the marshal to hear it directly before deciding what to do about the bounty. Cobb was a fair man, in my experience of him over several years, methodical and unhurried, and he agreed to come in and listen rather than acting immediately on the description alone. Jesse told him the same account he had told me. Cobb listened without interrupting, in the particular way of a lawman who has learned that interrupting a story is the fastest way to miss the details that matter. When Jesse finished, Cobb was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The transfer wagon ambush. 2 weeks ago. County records have that." Jesse said, "Yes." Cobb said, "And the payroll thieves who hid it, we caught 2 of them last week in Laramie. They're talking, trying to reduce their sentences. One of them mentioned an escaped prisoner they'd inadvertently freed during the ambush. Said he ran off north, wounded, they thought, from the confusion of the fight." Jesse said nothing. I said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. Cobb said, "That matches your account." He was quiet again, thinking. Then he said, "Holloway's Bank. I've had my own doubts about that investigation. It closed faster than these things usually close, and there were details that never sat right with me. I'll need to send word to Cheyenne and have this looked at properly. But I'm not going to arrest a wounded man on a 5-day-old suspicion when a 2-week-old confession from Laramie corroborates half his story already." He looked at Jesse for a long moment. He said, "You'll need to stay available while this is investigated, not run." Jesse said, "I understand." Cobb looked at me. He said, "You took a considerable risk, Sarah, harboring a wanted man on your own judgment." I said, "I took the risk I thought was correct." He said, "You were right, this time." I said, "I generally am." He almost smiled, which for Marshal Cobb was a significant display of humor, and he took his leave with the promise to send word to Cheyenne and to return within the month with whatever answer came back. I want to describe what those 6 weeks were like, because they were not comfortable, regardless of how the story ultimately resolved. Jesse remained on my property under an informal arrangement with Cobb, not under arrest, not entirely free, a kind of suspended status that required him to remain available and required me to vouch, implicitly, for his continued presence. The town of Millbrook, 4 miles east, had opinions about this. A woman harboring an accused bank robber and killer, whatever the marshal's private reservations about the original case, was not a situation that passed without comment. I heard some of the comments directly and inferred the rest. I did not change my position because of the comments. I had made my judgment based on what I had observed directly, and the opinions of people who had observed nothing were not, in my accounting, equally weighted evidence. This was either wisdom or stubbornness. I have never fully resolved which, though I lean toward believing both were operating simultaneously. It took 6 weeks for the full truth to surface. Holloway, the bank owner, had needed a fast resolution because an internal audit was about to reveal his own embezzlement, and the robbery, which he had arranged with 2 hired men, had been intended to cover a shortfall that would otherwise have been discovered. Jesse, an innocent bystander with no local ties, had been the perfect scapegoat. The actual robbers were apprehended in July, in New Mexico, attempting to spend marked bills. Holloway was arrested the same week. The bounty on Jesse was formally withdrawn in August, with an official notice of exoneration published in the same paper that had originally condemned him, on page 4, not page 1, which Jesse noted with the particular dry humor of a man who has learned that injustice is loud and correction is quiet. He stayed at the Prescott place through his recovery, which took the better part of 2 months, and by the time he was well enough to consider what came next, he had done more of the fence work and cattle management than a recovering man with a healed bullet wound had any business doing, out of what he described as an inability to sit still and watch someone else work land he was living on. I told him he didn't have to do any of it. He said, "I'm aware of that," which was, I noted, exactly what I had said to him on the first evening, and which he had clearly been keeping in reserve for the appropriate moment. By September, when his exoneration was fully official and he was free to go wherever he chose, he had not left, and I had not asked him to, and we had arrived at the particular understanding that 2 people reach when neither one wants to be the first to name what has become obvious to both. He asked me in October, at the fence line, with the Texas hill country going gold around us and my elderly dog sitting between us with the satisfied air of an animal who had made the correct judgment months before either of the humans had caught up. He said, "I don't have anything. No money beyond what the county eventually paid in compensation for the wrongful bounty. No land, no name that isn't slightly complicated by the last 6 months." I said, "I have 60 acres and considerable practice managing complications." He said, "I noticed." I said, "I noticed you noticing." He almost laughed, the real laugh, the one I had seen exactly 3 times in 6 months and had begun keeping a private count of. I said yes before he had entirely finished asking, which I understood, from his expression, was not the reception he had prepared for, and which I found I did not regret in the slightest. We were married in November. Marshal Cobb stood as witness, which he said was the least official duty he'd performed all year, and which he seemed to enjoy more than his usual work considerably. Jesse Colton had come to my barn as a wanted man with a bullet in his shoulder and a story nobody believed. He left it, eventually, as my husband, with a story that turned out to be entirely true. Some things you know by instinct before you know them by evidence. I fed a wanted man supper because my eyes told me something my fear should have overridden and didn't. I have never regretted trusting my own observation over a $500 description in a newspaper. That was the whole of it. That was everything.